Hello, everyone. This is Daily Tactics here, aka Ben Daily, and today we're going to be doing the first episode in the short story series I'm doing called Army Men War Stories. These episodes will be coming out every few weeks, interlaced with our Vault Tales series as well. This first one is called The First Backyard War. If you guys enjoy it, please be sure to leave a rating and let me know your feedback on this episode. The First Backyard War. Verna sat before his company officer in the reserve trenches. His shiny polished gray boots and freshly cleaned gray uniform were a stark contrast from everyone around him. His fellow soldiers were wearing shredded uniforms, caked in mud. Their faces, unlike Verna's trimmed and tender cheeks, were haggard and unshaven. Specks of mud dotted them like freckles. Their boots were the muddiest, with sticky earth acting as a third layer to their feet. The mud. That's what Verna's mind kept returning to. He'd never seen so much mud in his life. At university, everything was prim and polished, from the marble buildings to the bright green grass that was kept regularly trimmed. Even the nearby sewer drains weren't dirty. Despite the bars of the sewers towering over them, the government regularly sent cleaners up there with toothbrush heads to scrub them of dirt. University hadn't prepared him for the dirt of war. It had merely convinced him to go. The officer was sitting on a stack of discarded matchbooks. He had a mustache resting on his upper lip, as leisurely as he was relaxing before his men. Verna couldn't quite remember his name, but he knew that he liked the man. He always appeared casual and warm to Verna. But when it came to the speeches he had given, they were inspiring. He spoke with a fervor completely uncharacteristic of his visible demeanor. On one particular occasion, while speaking to students at the university, he had managed to receive a standing ovation from the crowd, an award seldom received from the not-so-easily impressed Gray students. On this occasion, he seemed far less bombastic, getting to his feet and standing before the few hundred men sitting around the reserve trench. "Gentlemen, for some of you, this will be your first time on the front line." His voice was grave, but still recognizable. Hans Fischer. The name finally clicked in Verna's mind. "For others, you've known the hardships that will be ahead of you in the coming weeks. I won't sugarcoat it. Things will be difficult." Fischer took out a cigarette from his pocket and lit it with a lighter from his other pocket. Verna was never fond of smokers. They perforated the air and ruined the atmosphere for everyone else. But as he watched, he couldn't help but think it made Fischer look dignified. "This position has been under constant pressure from the enemies for months. The Lego brick walls are nearly destroyed beyond repair. A charge is anticipated at any moment." The officer began pacing down the rows of soldiers. "But there are some things we can do to deter that from happening. For one, artillery." He made an explosion with his hands. "Constant bombardment detracts from morale. Some of you gents already know that." He paused for a moment, looking at the faces before him. "Secondly, our brave stormtroopers have been raiding enemy trenches, keeping them on their toes." He looks over a group of soldiers in the back of the assembly. Verna noted that they were especially disheveled. Their uniforms were worn down, nearly to ribbons in some areas. But there was health in their cheeks. They looked nourished, unlike some of the veteran soldiers here. Not to mention, their muscles were well toned. Verna was impressed. "Finally, snipers. Something that every single one of you can do. I've ordered periscopes every few yards in the trenches. It's not required. But if you take up sniping and work for an hour, you get yourself an extra ration for the day. If you do it for 5 hours, you'll get extra rations every day for a week." Verna's eyes rolled at the mention of rations. Some of these peasant soldiers really needed bribery just to fight for their country. He had been disgusted by the lack of patriotism that had been rampant. It's part of the reason why he had finally chosen to sign up for the fight. Despite his mother's protests, he felt it was his duty to the Empire to fight. They needed to hold on to their position in the backyard, or risk losing their way of life to the other plastic nations. "Now remember, An army working together achieves victory. I needn't tell you the stakes of our efforts. That should be quite clear. So, if each and every one of you does your job, we'll win this thing. Fisher finished his speech with a nod. Verna and a few other soldiers that he recognized from training started to clap. It was a weak chorus, like a soft summer rain. It fizzled out as soon as it had started. Looking around, the experienced soldiers were staring with blank faces. It was as if they had been called to a board meeting at a company that they weren't a part of. After Hans Fischer left the reserve trenches to head back to the command center, the rest of the soldiers were ordered into the front-line trenches. Verna marched with a straight back, his chest puffed out despite the weight of his equipment. His rifle beckoned him towards the ground with the weight of its plastic, but he resisted. The soldiers in the front line who were being relieved began to trickle past. A few of them would pat the soldiers, replacing them on the back. There were even a few red soldiers in the mix. Verna had never seen a red in his life. He'd heard tales of them, extremely tough men who lived in the sandbox. Supposedly, they dug an elaborate system of tunnels underground as their homes. Rumor was it, they'd even trained ants to be their steeds. But that was just a rumor. They had joined this war as an ally when the Greens had initially attacked the Tans. They felt as though their territory was under threat if they did not join the war. After all, their mines were rich with war materials. Someone would come from them eventually. The Greys themselves had been dragged into this war by their alliance with the Tans as well. It had been set up as a deterrent from war with the Greens, whose allies were far weaker. But evidently, that deterrent did not work. The faces of the gray and red soldiers they were replacing screamed in exhaustion. Their eyes were sunken and accompanied by large black bags under them. They moved slowly but deliberately, following their orders with as much effort as they could muster, or were willing to muster. Overall, though, they seemed in good spirits to Werner. Nobody was shaking, crying, or muttering like madmen. Those were the symptoms he'd heard rumored about shell shock. He couldn't imagine being so weak-willed as to experience anything of the sorts. Upon reaching the front-line trench, Verna's nose crinkled. There was a horrific stench in the atmosphere. It was a mix of gunpowder, melting plastic, and insect repellent that had been utilized in gas bombs. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief to place upon his nose. Once doing so, a few giggles resounded around him. He turned to see two soldiers snickering at him. They were both dirty, their uniforms coated in mud and grime. One had a large mustache curling across his gray face. It was as greasy as an axle, and stiffly bounced with his laughter. The other was clean-shaven, showing a chiseled, handsome face. Bright blue eyes pierced through his stained face, squinting with humor. Verna quickly removed his handkerchief and shoved it back into his pocket, straightening his back and walking onwards into the cloud of stink. Eventually, he marched into a perpendicular intersection of the front line. At the end of it was an NCO, barking out orders to sluggish soldiers. As Verna approached, the NCO stopped him. "You lot, about 10 deep," he hollered at the men. "Go right down the trench, around 100 meters. You'll be in hole 6. Verna stood there, looking at the officer before him, self-conscious about being at the front of the line. He wasn't sure if he was supposed to move or wait for further instruction. "Well, go!" the NCO barked at him. Verna quickly moved his feet, going off to the right side of the trench. Once again, he heard the two soldiers behind him snickering. He gritted his teeth and kept moving. The trenches were much more cluttered on the front line. The soldiers were hugging the sides to let each other pass. And even when the path was often blocked by Lego bricks and rubble, every few meters was a slight dip in the trench where it got deeper. These were the holes where soldiers were able to sleep in the dugout sides. Verna got to the hole labeled 6 and turned around. The rest of the soldiers didn't react to him blocking their path and brushed past him. They began what looked like a routine practice many times, settling into different cubby holes, unstrapping various pieces of equipment, and chatting amongst themselves. There was a whirlwind of clutter in hole 6, and Verna was confused. They were there to work, to fight, to be patriots for the Grey Empire. Yet here they all were, unwinding like it was the end of a long day at a mouse ranch. Werner shook his head and grimaced. He looked down in a cubby by the front of the doorway. It was a small, shelf-like area with a torn-up cot laying on wooden boards above dirt. He frowned. This was a far step away from the comfortable mattress he had at his father's house. But he wouldn't complain. He wasn't that schoolboy anymore. He was a soldier. He reluctantly sat down on his cot. The men around him were still chatting. He gripped his rifle and sat up straight, his back making a perfect L with his legs hanging off the cot. He looked ahead, his mouth taut in determination. He would stay alert and await orders. After some time, the light of the day began to dim. The pencil stakes in the ground above the trenches cast long shadows over them. Werner was attempting to stay disciplined, remaining as upright as his tiring back would allow him. In the back of his mind, he was convinced that an officer would come by and see his display, see that he was taking the war effort seriously, ready to contribute at a moment's notice, but more importantly, seeing the slackers before him yammering like schoolgirls. But the officer never came. Werner's act of patriotism nearly went unnoticed. That was, until the two men who had snickered at him behind his back earlier in line approached him. "Staying at attention isn't going to do you any good out here," the man with the bright blue eyes said. "Why didn't you come to Gunter's cot? His parents gave him a piece of cake while on leave, and he's in a sharing mood." Werner looked down the trench line and saw, in the dim light of dusk, men huddled around a small table made of old sardine cans. Their voices were high, and their bodies moved with vibration from laughter. Werner turned back towards the two men before him. "No, thank you." He made a point to straighten his back once again. However, it wailed in soreness from the constant upright position. "You gunning for some kind of promotion here?" the man with the curly mustache asked bluntly. "You're not gonna find one. Only officers around here are the brats from university. They're not giving us ranks." Werner's face uncontrollably pinched in pain. He quickly tried to hide it, but the damage had been done. The mustached man's mouth hung open as realization dawned on him. "A university student? And they don't even make you as much as a bugler?" He whistled exaggeratingly. "Command must be really desperate for infantry now." Werner slouched down for the first time in hours. A tinge of failure ached in the back of his mind. It hurt worse than when he'd tried to ask out a blue exchange student in high school, only to be rejected in the middle of the halls. The blue-eyed man slapped his friend in the stomach. "Don't pay attention to Peter. He's a pain in the plastic." Peter glared back at the blue-eyed man, his mustache furrowed from his pierced lips. "I'm Manfred." He waited for a moment, expecting Werner to respond with his own introduction. He'd forgotten his manners and scrambled to reply. "Private Werner Weber. Join us if you want, Weber." The two men walked away towards the allure of cake. Werner watched them move down the trench, but did not follow. Nobody was acting like they were in a war. He was beginning to feel like he had been lied to, like the entire thing was some big hoax that he wasn't in on. Where was the glory, the fighting, the adventure? They were just sitting on their butts. He laid his rifle down on the inside of his cot, and then stretched out next to it. If this whole thing was a joke to everyone else, then he wasn't going to let himself be the fool aimlessly following along with it. He lay there for at least an hour. The sunlight was now gone. Now, the soft orange glow of candles cascaded through the dirt walls of the trenches. Haunting shadows were cast, reaching out to grab at the men who were still quietly chatting in Hole 6. The anger that Werner felt had begun to slowly melt away as he lost the energy and willpower to stoke it. With the fainting anger came the cool darkness of sleep. Boom! 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 Werner's head shot up in his cot, smashing straight into the wooden plank above him. His ears rattled and he moaned in pain. Boom! 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 His eyes snapped out of the daze and locked into his rifle. He grabbed it and hauled himself out of the cot in one swift movement. He crouched down beside the dirt wall. Boom! 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 The loudest noise he had ever heard sounded off from the direction of the enemy trenches. It was like the pounding of a hammer on steel, if you were putting your ear right against the anvil. Boom! Boom! Every thud shook the earth around Werner. Crumbs of dirt sprinkled down onto the top of his spiked helmet. He clutched his rifle with his white knuckles. Then came the explosions. Earth-shattering impacts. hitting rapidly, one after another, right in front of Verna. In front? Verna was confused. Were the Greens terrible with their aim? Verna looked around him. His fellow soldiers were all sleeping or quietly chatting amongst themselves in the soft flicker of flames. He was baffled by their nonchalance. "Take it easy," a familiar voice called from the left of Verna's cot. He turned and saw the sparkling blue eyes of Manfred looking at him. He was using his hand to hold his head up, with his feet crossed over each other in the cot. "How can you say that?" Verna harshly whispered, while still gripping his gray plastic rifle like it would protect him from the explosions. Manfred sat up and dangled his legs over the hole in the trench wall. His leather boots just barely scraped the ground. "There's a bit of an unspoken alliance between us and the Greenies over there." He nodded his head towards the enemy trenches. "An alliance?" Verna was confused. He hadn't heard any ceasefire news. "Well, an unofficial alliance. You see, as long as our artillery doesn't strike them, then they don't hit us with theirs." Verna's mouth hung open as more artillery fire struck a few yards ahead of their trench line. He was disgusted that his fellow Greys had been fraternizing with the enemy. "How long has this been going on? We have to tell somebody." He began to stand up and look for an officer. Manfred quickly sprung to his feet and put his hands on Verna's shoulders. "Verna, this is a good thing. In fact, the NCOs came up with it. Our artillery was ordered to strike just in front of the enemy trenches about 4 weeks back, and it seemed like the Greenies got the message and started doing the same. Now every time a new unit is cycled into our positions, the message is passed along to do the same thing." Verna's eyebrows narrowed and he took a step back from Manfred. Suddenly, things were starting to make sense to him. The childish behavior, the relaxed attitude, and the lack of fear from incoming artillery. The entire front was a sham. What about the stormtrooper raids? Or the trench charges? Isn't the High Command doing anything about it? "It's really not a big deal, Verna. The stormtroopers are more than happy to fake their job. And we haven't had orders to go up over the top in months. Command is too busy dealing with the massacre of the patio." Verna shook Manfred's veiny hands off of him. "We're supposed to be helping with the war effort, not hindering it." Verna yelled at the traitor before him. Manfred glared at him with a warning. Verna's outburst had set a number of eyes on the two of them. "You don't know how easy you've got it," a voice growled from behind Manfred. Manfred stepped to the side, allowing Verna to see a dark, shadowy figure behind him. The man stepped forward into the flickering light of the candles lining the trench. The menacing atmosphere could have made it a villain reveal in an opera. It was Peter, with his curly mustache as greasy as ever. He pushed his way past Manfred and got into Verna's space. He was so close that Verna could feel his breath against his cheeks as Peter breathed down on him. "I've seen little plastic boys like you before, pompous and arrogant, ready to storm every trench right up until the toy cupboard if they have to." "I wouldn't say," Verna started but was cut off by Peter. "You selfish upper-class heroes will get the rest of us killed. You come into these trenches thinking that the war is easy, that you'll get out of it alive. But if you had it your way, then every last one of us here would be melted plastic. Now listen here." Verna finally found his voice and growled angrily back at Peter. "This whole thing is bigger than any of us. If anyone is selfish here, it's all of you. This is for the sake of keeping the Grey Army's territory in the backyard. You're a naive kid that's never worked a single day. Now don't be a dummy and keep your mouth shut." His final words weren't a suggestion, but rather a warning. He turned to walk back into the shadows behind Manfred, who was grimacing to the side. Verna boiled in anger at the way he had been treated. He couldn't help himself but get the last words off. "I suppose you aren't smart enough to understand what this whole thing is about. You dumb lot are destroying the Kaiser's empire." Peter turned and swung his fist at Verna's face in one fluid motion. The impact was as hard as jumping belly first into a lake. The pain only registered in Verna for a mere moment, before everything went black. Verna's nose twitched. There was a rank smell around him. It twitched again. It was like a terrible ammonia deposit. His eyes slowly flickered open. He saw the night sky, completely black above him. The light pollution of the trench's candles snuffed out the stars. Suddenly, a flare emerged in the air. Its glow illuminated everything around Verna for a few seconds, and then it dimmed and went away. Boom, boom, boom. It was followed by the sound of more green artillery incoming. Verna was reminded of what he was doing on the ground. He rolled over onto his belly. He felt his clothes dampen. He sniffed. It was the foul aroma he had noticed earlier. It clicked in his brain. He was lying in a puddle of someone's pee. He quickly jumped to his feet and started brushing the front of his gray uniform with his hands. There was snickering around him. He looked about, and a number of gray soldiers were laughing at him from their cots. His face turned bright red. He bent down, grabbed his plastic rifle, and stomped off away from Hole 6. He wanted to put some distance between him and those traitors. Perhaps he could request a change in assignment, somewhere closer to the action. But he frowned, remembering that despite his university status, he couldn't even become an officer like his friends. He doubted that he had any pull with the command that could get him placed anywhere. He kicked a clump of dirt on the floor of the trench, sending it scattering across the popsicle stick planks on the ground. If he just hadn't gotten drunk the night before his aptitude test, he might have been selected for officer training. Instead, his friends had gone to the test without waking him. All of them were officers now, while he was stuck with the rest of the army. His pace slowed as helplessness washed over him. He simply wanted to prove himself. Maybe then he could rise through the ranks. But with his current situation, there was no way to advance. He slumped down onto the ground of the trench. It was narrow where he was compared to Hole 6, and there weren't any soldiers around. He was alone, listening to the constant thumping of artillery from across no man's land. He sat with his thoughts for a while, still drenched in urine. Eventually, another flare rose up above him. It illuminated the trench he was in with so much light that you'd think it was daytime. He noticed something resting on the edge of the trench. It was a long tube-like object. He stood up and grabbed it. It was one of the periscopes that Fisher had placed throughout the trenches. Werner put it back. If only Fisher had known that nobody here was doing a lick of fighting. He stared at it once again, realizing that maybe he could make a difference. It didn't take an entire company to use a sniper rifle. He could do that right here and now. Maybe if he was successful, command would take notice of him. Werner climbed halfway up the side of the trench wall, precariously balancing with his rifle strapped to his back. He leaned up over the edge of the dirt lip and looked over. Beyond him was hell. It was an endless sea of dirt, barbed wire, thumbtacks, and pencils acting as stakes. He hadn't seen so much mud in his entire life. It seemed like there wasn't a single surface out there that was dry. Every few seconds, artillery would impact the dirt, spraying it upwards like a wave in the ocean. Then, it would settle back into a still nothingness. Werner allowed himself a few moments to stare at the empty earth. It intrigued him. There was an invisible barrier there. 1 meter ahead, and he would surely be shot dead. But in the trench, he was safe. He wondered when the last time someone had gone beyond the trench line. It must have been weeks, according to what Manfred had said. Manfred. Werner remembered why he had come here. He reached over and picked up the periscope that was laying in the dirt beside him. It was covered in mud, which he tried to brush off before placing it up to his eyes. He crouched below the trench line with them, allowing the long mirrored shaft to prop up at the lip of the trench. Through them, he could see farther than his own eyes allowed. The only problem was that it was pitch black. His vision couldn't pick up anything more than a few meters ahead of him. He leaned against the trench, stumped. Perhaps he would have to wait until morning to get on with his heroics. He sighed and slouched. Whoosh! One of the enemy flares had stroked across the skyline ahead of him. It lit up the entirety of no man's land. Werner quickly took the periscope and looked through the enemy trenches. He could just barely see the start of the trench line before the flare began to fizzle out of the sky. Everything turned dark once again. He had an idea. If he could time his shots with the flares, then maybe he'd be able to actually aim. He waited a few more moments, and sure enough, another flare arced over his head. This time, he was ready. He took the periscope and scanned the enemy trench, looking over as much of it as he possibly could. But there was nothing. The light fizzled out once again, and Werner was left standing there with no target. He sighed and rested on the dirt walls. A lump was forming in his throat. This task was near impossible. So many moving parts would have to line up perfectly for this to work. He balled up his fist and punched the dirt before him. It smacked hard against the earth, stinging the side of his palm. The pain only amplified the feeling of hopelessness. But he knew he had to shake it off if he wanted to continue. His father's advice echoed through his head. Crying won't solve your problems. He rubbed his face and gritted his teeth. He could do this. And he would do this. Verna sat with the periscope ready, waiting for the next flare to go up. Once it did, he got to work. Scanning the trench was tricky. Go too fast, and you might miss the enemy. Too slow, and the light would go out. He went as slowly as his anxious hands possibly could. A few times he thought he saw the distinct bowl-shaped helmets he knew the Greens wore from his time in training. But every time, he wasn't convinced it wasn't just a pile of dirt. The light dimmed once again, and he was left without a target. He didn't give up all this time. He leaned against the wall, periscope at the ready, waiting. The sky lit up with the pop of a flare. Werner went to work once again, scanning the top of the enemy trench. The thin line of Lego bricks that supported the top of their trench wall was empty. He was beginning to worry that no enemies would be popping their heads up. But he shook off the dread, realizing that his own trench was so relaxed that the enemies must be as well. His determination paid off as he noticed two green bulls poking out of the trench. He narrowed his eyes through the lenses and saw the two bulls bob slightly. He licked his lips. Those were definitely two green soldiers. He grabbed for his rifle, but before he could raise it over the trench, the light went out. Rounds of artillery started to land in front of him once more. The green crews must have been cycling through predictable patterns. In his haste, Werner hadn't realized that his arms had been shaking. He tried to tighten his grip on the rifle to get them to stop, but they continued to jitter. It seemed like each explosion made them get worse. Before he could get them to calm down, another flare soared through the night sky. He popped up over the trench wall. The artillery impacts in the near daylight were even more terrifying. The sheer force of the shells looked as though they could level an entire city block. Werner raised his shaking hands and looked down the sights of the rifle. He squinted and could just barely make out the two bulls without the periscope. He was pressuring the trigger on the gun, but he couldn't bring himself to squeeze it all the way. One of the helmets tilted backwards, and Werner could swear he saw the bright eyes of a young man just barely peeking over the trench. His hands began to sweat as the shaking intensified. Then, the light went out again. He felt like a massive tension was just lifted from his body. The artillery fire still remained in his area. It was blasting away at the empty fields on the destruction before him. Werner began to bounce on the balls of his feet, trying to shake off the nerves. The artillery around him kept his eyes darting from impact to impact. Then, the next flare went off. Werner slapped himself in the face, hard. Extending the rifle before him, he settled it into the dirt, nuzzling it into the small nest where it would stay steady. The sting of his cheek helped him concentrate through the iron sights of his gun. The small loop fit perfectly around his helmet as he lined it up. He chose the soldier on his left, the one who hadn't shown his eyes. He pulled. Bang! Ting! The sound of the bullet impacting on the plastic helmet echoed through the air. There was a quiet scream coming from the other trench. Then there was silence. Werner waited for a moment, the rifle still raised before him. He felt a pride move through his chest. He was serving the Grey Nation proudly, but his thoughts were soon cut off from yelling on the other side of No Man's Land, which was soon followed by a series of flares jetting up through the sky 10 times more than he had seen just moments earlier. The soft sound of boots on popsicle stick planks sounded from his left. He turned and saw the glaring eyes of Peter and Manfred racing towards him. "Get down, you idiot!" Peter screamed towards Werner. Werner stood there, eyes narrowed. "You're welcome for serving our nation. You know, if everyone here would..." He was cut off by the sudden booming sound of what he thought was hundreds of artillery cannons firing off at once. He saw the flash of muzzles off in the distance, as if fireflies had suddenly filled the night sky. Then there was the whistle. Hundreds of angry hornets were arching overhead towards him. A plastic body crashed into him, and he was shoved into the dirt of the trench. Then the entire earth was on fire. Scorching hot sparks filled his entire world. They whipped his face, melting bits of his cheeks off. The entire earth trembled, and parts of it erupted like volcanoes. Thumbtacks, pencil tips, wood shards, and barbed wire were shot into the air. They tore at his clothes and ripped into his plastic body. The bombardment lasted for what felt like an hour. He was huddled in the bottom of the trench, the warm body of who he thought was Manfred pressed onto his side. He sobbed. He sobbed for nearly the entire bombardment. He couldn't stop. He couldn't control himself. His previous tremor had turned into full spasms of his muscles. He couldn't catch his breath either, due to the smoke and dirt that filled the air. As suddenly as it had started, the bombardment stopped. There was nothing. Complete silence as the earth stood still. The person on top of Verna didn't move. He tried shaking them, but they remained prone. Verna slowly rolled them off of him. It was Peter. His curly mustache had been burned off by the sparks. His gray eyes were open, but they didn't move. He was dead. Verna felt his heart sink. The man who had tormented him had saved his life. A red thumbtack was sticking out of the back of the gray soldier. It had impacted him, a mere millimeter from Verna himself. Verna staggered backwards shakily and tripped over something solid. He fell hard onto the splintered popsicle sticks. He looked at what he had tripped on. It was the body of Manfred. His plastic was melted and crushed. His eyes were closed tightly, the bright blue hidden from sight. He lay motionless, unmoving. Verna sobbed more, crushing his splintered gray hands into his face. There was yelling from all around him. Soldiers were screaming in pain or urgency. Then there was light. Millions of flares dotted the skyline. Then the sound of artillery taking flight from not only the green trenches but the gray trenches as well. The sky was filled with the sound of hornets. It was starting again, and all Verna could do was watch. Watch and wait for hell to descend upon their small trench in the great big backyard that he had so badly wanted to fight for.